Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits. I have beaded initials on my 1890s stocking reproduction. I have a colors spinning experiment, and I have some unexpected surprises from our Guild's garage sale. So let's get started. Last week, I was showing you a book I had acquired called the Ohio Knitting Mills Knitting Book. The book includes the history of this company and patterns for hand-knit versions of the sweaters they manufactured throughout the decades. I got a comment asking about one of the sweaters shown in the book, which was called a poor boy shirt. The commenter was from the UK and said they hadn't heard of that sort of shirt before and wanted to know more about it. Well, I had never heard the term before. I had seen it in the book. I didn't know if that was a name that the mill had come up with themselves to describe that sort of shirt, or if it was a more widely used term. I couldn't find any mention of the term in newspapers until the 1960s, but then I looked at the book's explanation of this type of sweater. The Ohio Knitting Mills manufactured this type of sweater since the company first started as the Stone Knitting Mills in 1927. So they manufactured 3 different kinds of sweaters at first: a pullover, a cardigan, and then the poor boy, which was a lightweight cotton knit shirt with short sleeves. By manufacturing something that was worn during the spring and summer, not just fall and winter, their factory was able to stay open for production throughout the whole year. By the end of World War II, sportswear was really popular, and so was the poor boy. The examples of poor boy shirts that the Ohio Mills produced are from the 1940s. And of course, there were lots of short sleeve sweaters for women in the 1940s, but there were some iconic images of short sleeved knit shirts for men, like those worn by Gene Kelly back in the 1950s. The book says that the poor boy helped build the foundation for American style, including today's t-shirt. So these shirts weren't just popular in the US, they were also popular in Europe too, but it's not clear to me what the origin of the name poor boy is. Like if that's the term that the mills used themselves, or if it was a term that was created later on. When I searched old newspapers, I couldn't find any mention of that term until the 1960s, when the style was typically worn by women, but I did find ads for short sleeve cotton sweaters from the 1940s. Some definitions of poor boy state that these are sweaters for girls or women and that they are ribbed. So one theory is when you see a ribbed sweater, like if it was sitting on a table, it's going to look really narrow, and this type of sweater tends to be short in the body and it has short sleeves. So it looks like a sweater that's too small for the person wearing it, and therefore you are a poor boy somehow. So regardless of the origin of the name, they're pretty cool looking shirts. A few months back, I mentioned a story I had seen come up in my various social media feeds about an organization called Loose Ends, which was started, I think, a year ago, or it might be 2 years ago this fall. Loose Ends is an organization that matches volunteers with people who have incomplete craft projects that were started by a deceased family member. So they match up the project with somebody who is able to do that, and they try to do it locally. So there are thousands of volunteers all over the world who are willing and able to complete projects for people. I'll leave a link to their Instagram feed down below so you can see some of the kinds of things that people have done for these families. I did register as a volunteer for their organization, and the other day I got a newsletter in my email, and what they said was that the response has been so overwhelming on the part of volunteers that they currently have a 12-to-1 ratio of volunteers to projects that need to be completed. So they have 12 times as many volunteers as they have projects. And so they really want to get the word out to people that this is something that that is available to them if they have an unfinished project that their mother or aunt or grandmother or uncle or brother or whoever it was died without finishing it, that they will hook you up with a volunteer who can do that for you. So I'm going to leave a link, in addition to their Instagram feed, I'm going to leave a link to the flyer that explains what the Loose Ends Project is, so that you can spread the word, whether you want to be a volunteer for them or if you know somebody who is looking for this type of service. This tidbit came from my partner in spinning crime, Elizabeth, who recently sent me a link to a Twitter thread that was absolutely fascinating. It's about a piece of clothing known as the Lendbreen tunic, which is from the Iron Age. The Twitter thread explains where the item was found in a melting Norwegian glacier, that it's made of wool, and it's about 1,700 years old. That on its own is fascinating, that it's just survived this long, but she goes on to explain the amount of labor that would have been required to create this very basic sort of rectangular tunic. I had a tidbit a few weeks ago about Norwegian sails and how they were created from wool, and that there was a school in Norway teaching these really old traditional methods of making and building things like these old ships and the sails. Well, they did that for this tunic as well, from plucking the wool from the same type of primitive breed sheep that would have been used in the original tunic, to spinning that wool on a spindle, because there weren't spinning wheels yet, weaving it, making it, all of that. And it's just an incredible amount of labor in terms of the number of hours that it takes to do something like that. Today's clothing is the cheapest it's ever been in human history, but it used to be really expensive. People didn't have tons of clothing. Fabric was precious. So in today's dollars, if you count up the labor needed to make something like this, and that labor was paid, this tunic would cost $38,000 to make. So, of course, this would have been made at a time where everybody worked all day to survive, and they did so cooperatively through growing food and building structures and trading and bartering. But it's no accident that the Industrial Revolution started by speeding up the process of making fabric. So I'll leave a link down below to this Twitter thread, and I hope you enjoy the rabbit hole. Back in June, I had the opportunity to examine some stockings that were knit in about 1890. These were stockings knit by Christiana Gultenboat when she was still unmarried and living in Germany. She immigrated in 1890 to marry her fiancé, who had arrived in the U.S. Several years before. So the stockings included her maiden name initials, which is how we know that they were knit before she came. I got to see the stockings in person. I made some observations about how they were constructed, took some photos, and then later decided to make them part of my long-term project to understand the evolution of the hand-knit stocking. So I designed the stockings by examining the photos I had taken, looking at the blown-up versions of them. But there was a point in knitting the first stocking where I had some questions about how things were done in the foot that I couldn't see from my photos. So Christiana's great-granddaughter and namesake, Christine, generously brought them back to my studio so that I could look more carefully at them and really examine them. It was during the second examination that I realized the original stockings had been knit flat up to a certain point before they were joined in the round in order to form the tube of the leg. It was also the point where we were becoming convinced that the two stockings weren't from the same original pair. The stitch patterns around the tops of the stockings were different, but they were knit with the same yarn at the same gauge. The feet were constructed the same. They had the same beads used in order to put the initials in them. So we came up with various scenarios, like to explain why these two stockings would have different stitch patterns. But it was during the second examination that I realized they had different numbers of stitches. The calf shaping was done slightly differently. So there are just enough differences in them that it just didn't make sense at all that they were the same pair. They were from two different pairs. So I want to go to the overhead and I can show you the progress on these stockings with the beaded initials and what more I've learned so far. So I put my initials in beads on the first stocking, the complete stocking that I did where I was knitting it totally in the round. So I looked at the original photos to see where the beads were placed, and they were placed, you know, pretty close to the seam line, and they seemed to take up about half of the stocking width. So if you look at this, they took up about half. My thought was that I would use the Gothic alphabet that Christiana had embroidered in her sampler, because it appeared that she had used Gothic letters for hers. A lot of the beads were missing. They had fallen out over the years and broken, but it did look like she had used the Gothic alphabet. So I translated the letter R into a chart like this. What I realized was that it took 14 stitches, and I needed a couple of stitches from the edge. So I needed one of the seam lines plus maybe 2 plain stitches. So that's 3 there. And then I needed at least 1, if not 2 stitches between each of the letters. And I realized that because my gauge is different than the one she was working at, I'm working at 9 stitches per inch and she was working at 12, that this was going to end up being quite a bit further. So this is 47 stitches across here, and I would have needed, you know, 30, I think. I would have ended up coming to about here, and I just thought that was too, and they were too long. It was like, it just seemed too big. So I looked online for some other, you know, Gothic alphabets, and I found one, and so I charted out these. And so instead of being 14 by 12 rows, so it's 9 by 8 instead of 14 by 12. It's smaller, but I just think it fits better. I posted this on Instagram because I had some trouble doing this at first. I thought, well, all I have to do, you know, is count over from the edge. This is like the seam line. Just count over, you know, 3 stitches, and I, you know, put this bead in, and I'll just, you know, follow the grid. But it can be tricky to make sure that you're always staying on the same line or in the same column. And I realized I'd gotten the first one done. It looked pretty good, but not great. And then I started the second one. I'm like, this is like sloping uphill. I'll put a picture on the screen so you can see what it looked like. And so I thought, okay, I need to create sort of some guidelines for myself so I can make sure that I'm staying on the right rows. So I took some colored thread and I wove them in and out into the row of stitches that's right below where the first row of beads are, and then another one in the row above where the last row of beads was going to be, and then another vertical line up in the center in between the 2 letters. And then I was able to make everything line up. Now, I posted this on Instagram, somebody said, did you mean to do that? It looks like they're upside down. It seems like they should be in the other orientation. This is how Christiana had done it. And if you think about it, these are stockings that are worn under a long skirt. Nobody is going to see them except the person who's wearing the stockings. Nobody's going to see the lace part either. It's like wearing pretty underwear. It's mostly for yourself. It's not for other people. I mean, you could have a partner who would see them as you're getting dressed or undressed, but it's not for them, it's for you. And so when you are wearing these stockings and you look down, you can read your initials. It's not meant to be read by anybody else, so it doesn't have to be in the orientation that they could read them. So I did them upside down because that's how Christiana had done them herself. So I have done, this is, you know, obviously not washed and blocked, it's really rolling up. So I have done the other stocking, which is a different stitch pattern, and it ended up being longer because I did it exactly as it was done in the original one, and because my gauge is different, this is longer. For this one, I did the repeats until it was the length of the original stocking. So this one ends up with a longer lace pattern than this one had, but it's a different lace pattern anyway. And what I had done with this one was to knit it the way that I realized Christiana had actually knit hers. I knit this first one in the round because that's what I assumed needed to be done. But when I went back and studied them a second time, I realized that they had been knit flat until just past the lace. I ended up going a little bit further, and I thought, well, hold on a second. When did she switch this? And so I didn't rip back. And so I joined in the round a little bit later. I was trying to figure out why would she have done this, and one reason I came up with was that when you fold the hem over like this, you will have an edge right here on the inside. You'll seam it all up on the outside, but you'll have a hem here, and that'll make it easier to thread through your cord or ribbon or whatever it is you're going to use to hold your stockings up, because these are like knee highs. They go right up to the knee, but they're not going to stay up. There's no ribbing. It's not going to stay up. So it needs something. And so that would help. What I didn't understand is, why did she keep knitting it flat? And maybe she's more comfortable knitting lace flat than in the round, or maybe she thought it would be easier to do the beads if she had an opening here and could do the beads there rather than having to, reach way up here. I found that, once I got the needle through the first time, it was pretty easy to work. I didn't find this too hard to work with. It was just attaching the needle and then turning it inside out and doing the knots later. So it could be that this is going to be a lot easier to do. That was my initial thought, but I really don't know. It could be a combination of reasons, to keep the edge open, and because she likes working flat, and because she wants to make the beads easier. I just don't have the answer to that. I'm not going to be knitting the entire stocking, at least that's not my plan at this point. For this one, I wanted to knit it far enough, like to get down to maybe the decreases. We'll see. I don't have enough in this skein. I have more skeins of this to finish it. We'll see. I might just decide, just go for it. It's not that big a deal. Just do it. I might decide to do that. We'll see. But that's what the state of that is. I do have this one completed and with the beads on, got that all figured out. And so this one is just to see what the difference is with sewing it up in order to get what looks like this sort of seed stitch pattern right here, having it look like that with the flat seam that comes along here. We'll see how successful I am with that. I'm plugging along on spinning the yarn for my future sweater, and I'm still thinking about ideas about what the design of the sweater is going to be, but I've also been working on a spinning color experiment. I mentioned it last week, so I want to show you what I did this week with the experiment. So let's go to the overhead. I've been doing quite a bit of experimentation with spinning, some practice on specific techniques, and then experimenting a little bit with some other things, just by pulling out things I had in my fiber closet, like that I created in classes and things like that. So one of the things I had created was a bat of this dark brown wool that had some pink in it. And I thought, well, I'll just spin this up and see what it looks like. And I made a 3-ply yarn, and I actually liked it quite a lot. It was this dark brown natural wool with the pink in it. I thought, well, and this is all I had was the smell, so I couldn't do anything with it. But I thought that could be a really interesting thing to maybe use for a yarn in a sweater, a hand spun sweater. And so I wanted to do some experimentation with fiber I had on hand. I have a lot of this on hand. This comes from Brown Sheep Company here in the US. And when they are switching from one color to the other on their machines, they get this stuff where you get, one color, and the other, you get both colors. And so you can't turn this into yarn. And so the woman I had bought my spinning wheel from just gets these and then gives a pound of it to whoever buys the spinning wheel. So it was just for practice. And so I thought, oh, what I could do is I could card this in my drum carder, and it would blend it together and create a light gray. And then I could add some color. So I would use 1.5 ounces of this and 1/2 ounce of this. So that same 3 parts to 1 part that I'd done with supposedly with the brown, and get us and see how that works. I did that. I had a 2-ounce bat. I divided it into 3 parts so that I could do 3 different bobbins, and I could spin, you know, I could do a 3-ply yarn. So I spun up the first one, and I thought, you know, I think I am going to end up with more color in here than I was expecting. I don't know if that's because in my original bat, if I maybe didn't use the entire 1/2 ounce of pink, or maybe there's something about a dark yarn that allows you to pick up those flecks a little more easily than using a light color yarn that you're trying to add color to. I expressed last week that, oh, I don't think it's going to turn out the way I want. And someone suggested in the comments that I do some additional gray, and that I have a bobbin of just the gray that I blend with 2 bobbins of the color, and maybe that would adjust it a bit. And I thought that was a really good idea that I wanted to take a step further. So I wanted to do one where I had 3-ply all color, a 3-ply where I have 2 color, 1 gray, and a 3-ply where I have 1 color and 2 gray. In one sample, I'll have 3 different bobbins that all use all the color. So 1 part of color for each one of those. The next one is going to be 2 parts of the color, and then 1 part is going to be gray. And then on the third one, I'll have 1 part color, and then I'll have 2 parts gray, because I'll have 2 bobbins with gray and just 1 with the color. So I wanted to figure out, well, how am I going to do this? I'm starting out with 2 ounces of the color, and so each of these bobbins has 2/3 of an ounce of fiber spun on it. How is I going to do that? So I looked at how many parts I have of color. That's 6 parts of color and 3 parts of gray. And so I need twice as much color altogether as gray. And so that means since I have 0.67 ounce on each of the bobbins, then on these right here, I would do 1/3 of an ounce. So I needed 1 ounce total of the gray, and then I needed to divide that up into 3 so that I could spin it onto separate bobbins. So I have 0.3 ounces gray on each of 3 bobbins, and then I have 3 bobbins that each have 6 ounce. Well, how am I going to spin this? How do I know when to stop spinning? So what I'm going to do is start with, because right at the moment I have 1 spool of gray, but I have all 3 of the colors. I'm going to start with this one. I'm just going to ply them together. So each of these currently has 2/3 of an ounce on it. But this one only has 1/3 of an ounce. So I can spin all these 3 together until this one runs out. And that's going to leave 1/3 of an ounce left approximately on each of these. Then I can take my other 2 bobbins of gray and I can spin those together with this one. And when those run out, I'll have 1/3 of an ounce left on this one. And so the final ply that I will do will be the 3 together. And then I'll be able to see which one works. My suspicion is that really this kind of technique probably works best with a darker color than it does with a lighter color. And that's part of the learning process. It's just figuring all of that out. Here's the yarn after it's been plied. On the left is the yarn where all 3 yarns had a 3-to-1 ratio of gray to the colored roving. In the center is the yarn with 2 plies of the gray to colored mix and a single of just the gray. And on the right is the yarn with 1 strand of the gray colored mix and 2 strands of just gray. And here are the yarns after they've been washed. They puffed up quite a bit from their washing. Each one I think is really nice. I really like all three of them. So I'm going to have to knit them up into swatches to see what I think of the results. And I'll also knit up a swatch from the dark brown and pink yarn that I made first to see what that looks like as well. So this has been a really fun experiment so far, and I cannot wait to see what those swatches look like once they are already knit up. Our Knitters Guild takes donations of yarn from members who are destashing or even from the general public. I think one of the most frequent questions I get from the general public when I volunteer at the state fair at our Knitters Guild booth is, what do I do with all this yarn that my mother-in-law left behind after she died? You know, that sort of question. So those donations are used for a couple of different purposes, depending on the type of yarn it is. We don't accept 100% synthetic yarns, but we do take blends of synthetic and natural fibers. So machine washable yarns, particularly those that are blends of synthetic and natural fibers, are often put to use with our service knitting projects because our service partners often need items that are machine washable. The really nice luxury yarns are sold at an end of year silent auction. And then the rest of it goes to our garage sale. We don't have a garage sale every year, but we did have one in 2021, and then we had one this past weekend. So the two books that I showed you last week, this vintage Begin to Knit book from the 1960s, and then this Ohio Knitting Mills book, which is more recent book that had all these vintage designs in it. Those were left over from the previous garage sale. Nobody had wanted them. And because it's known in the guild that I enjoy vintage and antique knitting and I collect publications related to that, they were just offered up to me and said, do you want these? Because otherwise we'll put them back in the garage sale again. So I took those, and then my plan for going to the garage sale this year was to look at the books. As I've mentioned many times, I am not a yarn stasher, so I do not impulse purchase yarn just because it's pretty. I used to do that, but I learned over the years that it never gets used. If I don't have a project in mind, it's never going to get used, and then I end up donating it. So I just not planning on doing that. I do have a couple of exceptions to my no stash rule. One of those is self-striping sock yarn. So I knit a lot of socks, and often I'm knitting for other people, and those other people are mostly out of state or even out of the country. So if I'm going to offer to knit them some socks, I'll send them a picture of some of the yarn that I have on hand. They can pick what they want. So again, I was not planning on getting any yarn at the garage sale. I did have one thing in the back of my mind, a project that's kind of been on the back burner for a few years, which is to knit myself one of these traditional Danish sweaters. So the Danish night sweaters originated in like the 16th or 17th century. They were based on those really fancy silk shirts, like the one that Charles II was executed in. And so those were adapted into wool and amongst the common people. So those are really the first sweaters. And so that's something that I've been interested in. But I normally knit sweaters in worsted weight, and these really require a fingering weight yarn. They're just, the stitch patterns that are on there are on a scale that it needs to be at fingering weight. So I thought, well, I'll go to the garage sale, I'll look at the books. If I can find a sweater's quantity of fingering weight wool in a color I like, so I can make one of those Danish night sweaters, I'll do that. So I didn't find any books I wanted, and I didn't find a sweater's quantity of fingering weight wool, but I didn't come away from the garage sale empty-handed. So let's go to the overhead and I'll show you what pulled me in. The red dot means $5, so I got two 50-gram skeins of the Regia, and I love a sock yarn with pink or purple in it. I don't know why, but I can't resist them. So this is exactly the kind of colorway that appeals to me. I also got some blue and black because that appeals to other people that I knit for. Again, $5. Then I got this one again for $5. This is Knitability Splashing Feet. I've never heard of this, but this is a colorway I've knit with before, like from other brands. I love this color. I had to have that. Again, just $5. And then this was $10. 3 100-gram balls of opal sock yarn. It's another German brand, that sock yarn that I used to knit with a lot. I don't see it as much in the shops here as I used to, but then 3 of them for $10. Again, colors that either I like or people I knit for are going to like. Then this is a pattern that I was looking for desperately online a few years ago. Someone at a knitting group I went to was making those and told me what the name of the pattern was and who the designer was. She's local to Minneapolis, and when I looked online, I could only find that Scassel, which is the Addy distributor here in the US, they were selling these at one time, but they were out. They weren't for sale on Ravelry, and you use sock yarn to create basically these kind of balloon animals. You're knitting these kind of tubes, and then you tie them all together, and then you end up with this little stuffed animal. And so I was just dying to have that. And so it's got all of these. It's got a monkey, penguin, tiger, poodle, elephant, duck, crocodile, a flower tiara, a bee in 3 colors, and a bird in 3 colors. And what's even better is that this apparently came from a yarn shop that she closed her yarn shop down. And so she donated this as well as to some kits that she had sold in her shop. And so the kits have the exact yarn. Like these were designed with certain types of sock yarn colorways in mind. So the little tiger has this kind of tiger print sock yarn. So there, I have a bunch of these kits. This one is for the crocodile, and this is a bee. I've got a little bird. So I have a whole bag full of these, and so I got the pattern and all of these little kits, so with all the exact yarns that are necessary. I got the whole thing for $15. And I was so excited because that was one of those serendipity things where I had been desperately looking for this thing and wanting to knit it for so long. And there it fell into my lap. So those are the things that I got at the garage sale, thinking I wouldn't come away with anything. Now, while I didn't find any books I wanted at the garage sale, I came into a windfall of a different sort later that day. A guild member who used to live here in Minnesota but now lives out of state happened to be in town last weekend for her annual embroidery guild retreat. So this embroidery retreat has what they call a stash reallocation table, where stitchers can destash things that they are no longer able to use and which they hope they can find a good home for. So this guild member messaged me earlier in the weekend about some vintage magazines that were at the stash reallocation table and that nobody else had wanted. And so she described them as like McCall's Needlecraft magazines from the 1930s and 40s, and sent me a couple of photos to show what kinds of things were inside the magazines. So from the photos, I assumed there were just a couple of magazines, and I said, sure, I'll take them. It turned out there was quite a large box full of magazines that were not from the 30s and 40s, but mostly from World War I and into the 1920s. There were a few from the 1930s. There were nearly 90 of them in total. I want to go to the overhead again, and I'll show you the oldest and the newest of this giant stack of antique magazines. So these are the 2 issues that I wanted to show you. This is the oldest one from June of 1914, and this is the newest one from May of 1936. So there are a few differences in terms of how the magazine changed that you can just see superficially. One is that they changed the format size. So this one was like tabloid size on newsprint paper, so that kind of paper with acid in it that turns yellow and kind of gets crumbly. And then this one is more like the size of Life magazine, which was very popular back then. So it got shorter and slightly narrower, color cover, and the paper is nicer. It's not newsprint, it's a little thicker. I can't show the whole page in here because it's just too tall and I can't get back any further. So the way that this magazine is presented in 1914 is that it's needlecraft devoted to home dressmaking, home millinery, fancy work, and household decoration. It was published in Augusta, Maine, which was like the central place for magazine publishing back at the time. So this was volume 5. So this is 1914. It started being published in like 1909, around there. And there's even a little article in here asking readers what their suggestions are for the 5th year anniversary souvenir. They talk about fashions, and these are patterns that you can order. They talk about, you know, all of the fashion, and then these are showing the sort of the silhouette, the drawing of them, and then what the pattern numbers are. And this novelties in neckwear, useful and pretty couch pillows. So this issue doesn't have any knitting in it, but it does have some crochet. But like a lot of women's magazines of the time, there weren't just craft things. There were articles, or in this case, it's some kind of a story. There's different chapters to it, you know, something dramatic going on. "Stop that screaming," cried Catherine. And then over here, this leering man, the caption says, "Danger in his eyes. He began to move around the table." We've got embroideries for the household. And here we've got sort of the letters to the editor section. This is where they're asking people what they would like for the next souvenir. Apparently there had been scissors and a thimble in previous years. Let's have a little case of crochet needles, say 3 in number, of different sizes, with a cork handle that will serve for all. I suggest for a next birthday present a dull silver hat pin, which we may wear in our hats to needlecraft clubs and parties. I think an emery bag shaped like a strawberry with a silver top and a little silk tassel would be a nice birthday souvenir and match the scissors and thimble. Somebody had a question about embroidering, and they couldn't figure out what to do, and the instructions didn't explain it, and so they provided an answer. This is the Needlecrafter's own page. So this is readers' submissions of things, some dainty things for the baby. And then we've got more fashion stuff, things for serge or taffetas, graceful shirtwaist dresses, cross-stitch embroideries. And then there's a simple lace border. Somebody's asking here for, will someone send directions for crocheting a doily in knot stitch entirely of crochet without linen center? Please make directions for widening very explicit. More fashion things, simple but smart frocks for misses, novelties and lingerie. And then some of the ads are interesting. 4 weeks free trial of a piano. Beautify the complexion surely, quickly. And then there's an advertisement. Do you need money? And you could become the person who in your hometown who sells World Star hosiery and clean knit underwear. You know, you can make $3,000 in your first year. 2 handsome centerpieces, pretty headgear for tots. And then here we've got some crochet. So there's number, and these issues seem to have a lot of filet crochet in here. Not here, but there are a lot of issues that do feature filet crochet. So this is a doily and centerpiece in crochet, art of dressing. So easy to get rid of skin troubles. And then we've got kids fashions and patterns right here. And then on the back cover, we have a racist cream of wheat ad, because it was 1914. So this issue is the 1936 issue. So this is, you know, it doesn't have any articles or anything on the front cover here, just an illustration. And then we've got a table of contents so you can see what there is, and there is a knitting thing in this one. We can see right here that there's a knitted item. And here we have a sexist ad. Edna's case was really a pathetic one. Like every woman, her primary ambition was to marry. Most of the girls of her set were married or about to be, yet not one possessed more grace or charm or loveliness than she. And as her birthdays crept gradually toward that tragic 30 mark, marriage seemed farther from her life than ever. She was often a bridesmaid, but never a bride. So it turns out her problem was halitosis. She just needed to gargle with Listerine. That was her entire problem. Now this is called Home Arts Needlecraft. And so we are in volume 27 in May of 1936. And we've got fashions like we did before. Old-time patchwork designs are used on modern summer bedspreads and porch cushions like those on page 13. Cut work of distinction, breakfast nook gaieties. So there's some embroidery stuff. Food facts. So they've added food to the magazine. And here's an article on modern living demands modern refrigeration. So instead of an ice box, you got an electric refrigerator. Tablecloths, embroidery club for girls. So this is junior needle crafters here. And then here is the knitted thing. This is a knitted suit. It is developed in the 16-year size and requires 10 balls of silk yarn and 1 pair of number 4 needles for working. The stitch measure is 6 stitches to the inch. So a US 4 is typically these days a 3.5 millimeter, and that sounds about right for 6 stitches to the inch. Needles earlier in this century hadn't quite been standardized. Like from one yarn company to the other, they'd have their own needles and they wouldn't always correlate. So there's a nice lace dress that you could make at 6 stitches per inch. Patchwork for modern uses. Imported frocks and how you can duplicate them. So sort of aspirational movie star type of things during the Depression era. And then they've got different recipes for things. It's got continuation of the modern refrigeration, but they've got recipes included in the ads, which is like, I remember this from my childhood in like the 70s, where they'd have an ad for something and then they'd have a recipe that included that product. Cakes that go with frozen desserts. So I guess that's a thing with modern refrigeration. You can have a freezer. And we've got more dress patterns. Wake up your liver bile without calomel and you'll jump out of bed in the morning raring to go. Hair you want and hair you don't want. Vaseline, so pure you can eat it. Oh my God. Needlework sale. And then on the back we've got an ad, this time for shredded wheat. That's it. That's what is in these. I'm going to be looking at these more carefully, issue by issue, to kind of see what's in there. Some of them, especially these really old newsprint ones, are missing the covers. They haven't held up. And sometimes it can be hard to tell, is it the cover or not, just because of the way that the format of these types of magazines early on when they're on the newsprint. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.